the effects of menstrual cycle phase and adiposity on energy balance in women. Then she continued on to do her PhD at University of Ottawa, where she studied the acute effects of sleep restriction and altered sleep timing on energy balance and food reward in humans. After doing her PhD, she came out to do a postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Cancer Epidemiology and Prevention Research at Alberta Health Services, where she studied a number of projects related to cancer prevention and survivorship, energy balance, and objective assessment of physical activity and sedentary time. And one interesting fact about Jess's scientific career is that she was nominated for the Alice Wilson Award offered by the Royal Society of Canada, which is an award for an outstanding woman with academic qualifications continuing on to do postdoctoral fellowship work. So some personal facts about Jess is that she has a goal to bike the Cabot Trail. And for those of you who don't know, it's a trail that goes through Cape Breton Island. And I encourage you to go check it out after the seminar because it does look like a beautiful bike ride to do. After her undergraduate degree, Jess was a tree planter down in New Zealand. But because of the boredom and monotony of tree planting, she also sought out a number of daredevil activities, which included bungee jumping, skydiving, whitewater rafting, and cave rafting. So she considers herself a bit of a daredevil, especially when you do stuff like a tree planting.
Yeah, that's what you took away from that, the tree planting.
Yeah.
That's what you took away.
And so once Jess also gave a talk down at the University of Moringa in Brazil, where she had to work with a Portuguese translator for a presentation. So Jess, today, if you want, we do have a couple people who can probably speak Portuguese, and if you'd like your presentation translated, we can do that.
Oh, great. Bring back some good old memories.
Yeah, right on. So today, Jess will talk about metabolic adaptations following weight loss, an evolutionary success story.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. When I was first approached to give a talk, and I think this is a seminar, musculoskeletal injury prevention or biomechanics, and I was like, I don't do that line of research. But then he says, well, it could be related to, exercise physiology and some of the previous work you did at the University of Ottawa. And so that's what I wanted to chat with you guys about today. So metabolic adaptation is related to changes in resting metabolic rate or your metabolism that occurs with weight loss. So I'll go into a bit more detail into defining this term in the next few slides. But before we get into defining metabolic adaptation, we first have to understand the general concept of energy balance. And so simply put, your adiposity levels or energy reserves, often commonly known as body weight, are directly related to variations in the energy balance. So energy intake, energy expenditure. Simply put, if your intake is greater than your expenditure, you will increase your adiposity levels or body weight, and vice versa. If your energy expenditure is greater than your intake, that's when it's said that you lose weight or reduce energy reserves. So if you look at the breakdown in both components of the energy balance, energy intake is very straightforward. So it's basically all food ingestion counts towards energy intake, and the only time or way you can influence energy intake is through food intake. And so you can break down energy intake in macronutrient composition. Here I have the relative contribution or recommendations of macronutrient according to Canada's food guide, and I think the majority of our diets kind of follow this distribution, where the majority of our intake is composed of carbohydrates, followed by fats, and finally protein. When we look at the other aspect of the energy balance or energy expenditure, it's a little more complex in that you have three distinct components to the energy expenditure. The first one and the biggest contributor is your resting metabolic rate, which contributes approximately 60-70% of your total energy expenditure. So if I were to lie down completely still with zero muscular movement whatsoever for a 24-hour period, I would expend 60 to 70% of the total energy expenditure that I typically expend in everyday lives. So this is just to indicate to you that just to keep our bodies alive, to keep us functioning, and to survive, we expend 60-70% of that total energy expenditure that's related to resting metabolic rate. The second component is called food thermogenesis, also known as the thermic effect of food. This accounts for about 10 to 15% of total energy expenditure, and it's the energy that your body requires in order to digest food as well as absorb the nutrients from those foods. And so this is directly tied to your energy intake, so the more food you consume, the greater your food thermogenesis, but there's also an impact of the carbohydrate breakdown. For instance, protein intake requires a greater amount of energy to digest and absorb those nutrients, and so it will lead to an increase in food thermogenesis, for instance, if you have a high protein diet comparatively to carbohydrates and fats. And the third and final component is what we call physical activity energy expenditure. And so this is the one behavioral component of energy expenditure that we can influence, and includes all muscular movement that falls within this category. So anything from the fact that I tend to talk with my hands a little bit, so this increases my energy expenditure. I'm speaking, so it's a little higher than if I was sitting still, all the way to planned physical activity or training sessions. So all activity that we do, all skeletal muscle movement falls within this category of physical activity, and it accounts for approximately 25 to 30% of your total energy expenditure. And so when we look at altering this energy balance, so in the majority of cases induce weight loss, we can have an impact on energy balance via two platforms. So we can alter energy intake, which influences 100% of one aspect of the energy balance, or we can influence physical activity energy expenditure, which impacts about, like I said, 25 to 30% of your total energy expenditure. And this is one of the reasons why when we talk about weight loss regimens, oftentimes diet is recommended over physical activity. Because when you look at this contribution, or this relative contribution, you're saying that, okay, if I can influence 100% of my diet to induce weight loss, why would I put all my efforts in impacting physical activity energy expenditure, or 25 to 30% of energy expenditure only? But for this particular talk, I'm going to put emphasis on variations in resting metabolic rate that occur specifically with weight loss. And so although this is not a behavioral component that we can directly influence, our behaviors or inducing weight loss and even weight gain can have a direct impact on your resting metabolic rate. So this table shows you the relative contribution of common organs as well as your body composition or skeletal muscle mass and white adipose tissue to your resting metabolic rate. And so as you can see, when you look at the organ contribution to resting metabolic rate, they require a lot of energy. So the heart, for instance, expends 400 calories per kilogram of weight per day, which is much higher than skeletal muscle mass and even more white adipose tissue, which has a relative contribution of 13 and 4.5 respectively calories per kilogram of body weight per day. Now, overall, our body composition or skeletal muscle mass and white adipose tissue have a greater contribution to our total energy expenditure in terms of resting metabolic rate. And that's because we simply have a greater mass of skeletal muscle as well as white adipose tissue comparatively to organs. So to use a practical example, our hearts, the typical size of a heart can be about 130 grams, or human heart, I should say. And so 130 grams will contribute about 150 calories a day of energy expenditure. So not necessarily the 440 that's associated with 1 kilogram. However, the majority of our body composition is composed of skeletal muscle mass and white adipose tissue, which leads to 95% of our total body mass, but contributing only 40% of our total energy expenditure in terms of resting metabolic rate. So just to apply these numbers to a practical example, if you have a 70 kilogram man with 10% body fat and approximately 3 kilograms of organ mass, their contribution of energy expenditure to resting metabolic rate would be divided up as follows. So 28 calories per day would be expended to maintain that white adipose tissue. 780 calories per day would be expended to maintain that skeletal muscle mass, and that's simply related to the fact that 90% of his total body mass is skeletal muscle mass. And then approximately 1,000 calories per day would come from organ tissue activity. So as I mentioned, this is related to 3 kilograms of organ mass.
Does he have bones?
So he Yeah, so he does have bones. We don't count that. Yeah, so we don't count that in that energy expenditure, but it would account for about 6 kilograms. Yeah. But when I used this example, when I taught this class, I pretended like he had no bones. So it was easier for students to calculate the contributions. And so if we were to take this same man and say, for instance, he were to gain weight. So if this man were to gain 2 kilograms of white adipose tissue and 3 kilograms of skeletal muscle, he would have an increase in a total resting metabolic rate of 47 calories per day. So this kind of puts things into perspective, because sometimes I've heard the common notion that, oh, if you increase your skeletal muscle mass, you'll increase your resting metabolic rate by quite a bit, or you'll kickstart your metabolism if you exercise more and you gain a lot of skeletal muscle mass. And so in this case, for instance, if you were to gain, like I said, 5 kilograms of body weight, increases it by 47 calories per day, it's a good amount, but it's equivalent to maybe a small apple, half a banana. So when you look at it in that perspective, you're increasing it, but not by large amounts. So if we were to take the same example and say that this man were to lose the same amount of weight, so lose 2 kilograms of white adipose tissue and 3 kilograms of skeletal muscle mass, then the same effect would occur, but in reverse. So they would decrease their resting metabolic rate by 47 calories per day. So if you say, okay, if I can't increase my resting metabolic rate by a lot by increasing my body weight, the reverse is actually good news, because then it doesn't decrease by that much if I lose 5 kilograms of body weight in this example. However, our bodies don't respond the same way to weight loss as it does weight gain. And so this is a meta-analysis or a compilation of all the weight loss studies that have been done in the literature, and they've looked at the changes in resting metabolic rate to these different types of weight loss. And so they've combined studies according to diet, exercise, combined diet and exercise, pharmacological interventions, which include drug treatment, and finally, surgical weight loss interventions. So here on the y-axis, you have the decrease in resting metabolic rate in calories per kilogram of body weight lost. And so there are differences between the different interventions. And so it's less via exercise and surgical interventions overall. But when you combine the data from all these participants, independently of the type of intervention, on average, the decrease in resting metabolic rate is 15.4 calories per kilogram. So a little bit higher than that 13 kilograms that we know is associated with skeletal muscle mass, but much higher than the 4.5 calories as associated with white adipose tissue. Now keep this in mind, because with the majority of weight loss trials, you will see approximately 80% of that weight loss will be in reductions of fat mass, and about approximately 20% is reductions of skeletal muscle mass. So the majority of our weight loss is white adipose tissue. So this is much greater than that 4.5 that we had initially estimated to be associated with white adipose tissue. So if we were to take this example, our previous example, and apply these new numbers that we know exist in the literature, so we expect it to be a decrease in 47 calories per day in resting energy expenditure with that 5 kilogram weight loss. But in reality, based on the 15.4 calorie per kilogram decrease that has been measured in the literature in weight loss trials, the actual decrease in this person would be 77 calories per day, leading to a difference in 30 calories per day, which is what we call the metabolic adaptation. So it's defined as the slowing of the resting metabolic rate that is greater than what you would expect or what you would predict would occur according to the changes in body composition. And so you have that decrease in resting metabolic rate that occurs with that decrease in body composition, but there's also this excess decrease that occurs for other reasons, or other biological reasons. And we're still trying to figure out what exactly contributes to this greater than predicted decrease in resting metabolic rate. So why does this occur? Why does our bodies respond very differently to weight loss comparatively to weight maintenance and even weight gain? And the most popular theory is related to our biological adaptations to prehistoric stressors. So prehistorically, way back when, our ancestors were hunter-gatherers. So they would have high levels of energy expenditure in terms of hunting and trying to forage food and capture food. And they would oftentimes go through long periods of famine, because if they were lucky enough to capture this mammoth, they had food for quite a bit of days, but then after, they didn't know next time they were able to capture another animal or a mammoth, for instance. And so they can go through long periods of famine with no energy intake and high energy expenditure through this hunting-gathering lifestyle. So if you compare that to our current world, where our genes seem to be maladapted to our current environment, where we have an opposite effect. Food is readily available, usually energy intake is not an issue, and the amount of energy expenditure that we expend to retrieve that food is often very minimal as well. And so this evidence is quite a bit dated now, but it's still very relevant, and it shows how individuals prehistorically living with obesity would have fared much better outcome comparatively to those lean individuals. And that's why I say that obesity in this case is an evolutionary success story, because it allowed a lot of our ancestors to survive through these long periods of fasting and famine. So to walk you through this table, the first two studies up top were case studies in lean men. And so these were instances where these men, for political reasons, decided to go through a complete fast. And so they went through a complete fast until death occurred. So these reports actually mentioned their pre-body weight. And so in the first instance, it was one man who was simply called Professor Swain. In the second instance, we had 9 men who were part of the Irish Republican Army hunger strikers. So they reported their pre-weight at the start of the fast, then they went through this complete fast, like I said, for political reasons. And then at the end of the fast, when death occurred, this was their weight at the time of death. So as you can see, they had lost quite a bit of weight, and the majority of that weight loss was fat mass. So just to give you a bit of more information as a tangent, we can lose up to 80 to 90% of our fat mass, but our skeletal muscle mass, your body tries to preserve it. So the majority of this remaining weight is skeletal muscle mass, or the little bit that's left, as well as organ tissue. So their overall survival time was approximately 50 to a little over 70 days, at which time they passed away. So I separate this one because in the article they separated this one man and said he only survived for 43 days. They didn't say why, besides saying that he had a serious gunshot wound. Now, they didn't specifically say that that caused the fact that he died a little earlier or what had happened to this particular man, but I'm just presenting it separately here because that's how the way it was presented in this particular study. Moving on to the last 3 papers. So the last 3 studies were clinical interventions, and so they were not political fasting situations, where they were performed in individuals living with obesity, and they were followed by a clinical team during this complete fasting intervention. And so this first one is probably the most famous one. It's a case study of one man who, at the start of the intervention, was 207 kilograms, so over 400 pounds, and fasted for 382 days, at which time he lived. He lived at the end of it and was 82 kilograms, so a little over 180 pounds at the end of this intervention, walked away from the intervention and was able to maintain actually that new weight for a little bit afterwards. And from what I know, and I did a bit of search when I was putting these slides together, and I didn't find anything to contradict this. This is the Guinness World Record for the longest sustained fasting noted to date. So a couple of our studies performed around the same time were done in a few additional participants. So again, you have individuals living with obesity who lost on average 30 to 40 kilograms of body weight during the intervention that lasted anywhere from 12 to 250 days. And all these individuals lived. But a note here that the fact that they lived was also related to if there were any complications in the fasting, then they were taken off of that complete fasting intervention. So a couple of participants, probably these individuals that only fasted for 12 days, developed hypoglycemia. There was also reports of gout that were developed. And so they were instead put on a low-calorie diet, or about 800 to 1,000 calories per day, which is super minimal still. To induce weight loss. But overall, this evidence taken together shows that those individuals living with obesity or that had higher body weight at the start were able to sustain or stay alive for these periods of fasting for a long period, these longer periods of fasting comparatively to lean individuals. So if we apply this data or this information to our prehistoric ancestors, you can see how living with excess weight or living with obesity prehistorically could have allowed you to live for a longer period of time. So moving on to a bit more realistic studies, let's say, where they were inducing partial energy restrictions. And I'm saying realistic, but the Biggest Loser TV show is anything far from realistic. So this team of researchers actually had a brilliant idea a few years ago, and some of you might have heard of the results from these studies in the media. And so what they did is, for one season of the Biggest Loser TV show, is they actually came in and they said, we're going to do all these physiological measurements in these participants while they're going through this weight loss intervention. So every week they did measurements of their resting metabolic rate, they took blood draws, they measured their body composition, and they did that every week during the show, so during the intervention, and then they did it at the very end. So that was a 30-week timeline where everyone came back for the reunion, right? And so they came in at that time, and then they announced the winner, and they did all these same measurements then in order to see the changes in these physiological measurements that are related to this massive amount of weight loss. And this is also an excellent platform to assess this massive amount of weight loss, because as part of this intervention or this TV show, these contestants, in this case, lived on a ranch, and their physical activity and diet was very tightly controlled, right? Which is something no researcher can do today in their lab. I couldn't decide and go to ethics and get approval to say, I'm going to recruit these 50 individuals and I'm going to have them live in my lab and lose weight, and I'm going to prescribe this diet. They're not going to be allowed to leave because I'm going to give them this physical activity regimen as well, right? So this is actually a perfect platform where everything was tightly controlled. You're getting rid of all of those external influences that we see as limitations in our research, and we're able to see these measurements or changes over time as a result of this massive amount of weight loss. So the results that they reported in these individuals was that at the end of week 6, they lost about 10 kilograms of body weight, but the majority of this amount of weight is fat mass compared to fat-free mass, which is what you would expect to see. At the end of week 30, so this is at the reunion stage, at the end of the complete intervention, on average, participants lost 60 kilograms of body weight. Now, this is a massive, massive amount of weight. And again, the majority of that weight loss is in the form of fat mass, with a little bit of reductions of fat-free mass, but this is very negligible comparatively to the large amount of body weight that they actually lost. So moving on to changes in total energy expenditure as well as resting energy expenditure. So here on your left graph, you have total energy expenditure at baseline week 6 and week 30. So in gray, you have resting metabolic rate, and in the white, you have non-resting energy expenditure. So this includes physical activity, thermic effect of food. So comparatively to baseline, there's an increase at week 6, which is what you expect. They're right in the middle of that intervention in the ranch, and so they're exercising quite a bit. So you see that increase in non-resting energy expenditure, which is also represented here on the white graph. However, of note is your resting metabolic rate, which actually decreased at week 6 comparatively to baseline, and it's on average 356 calories per day lower at week 6 comparatively to baseline. And then looking at the end of the intervention or week 30, you have a decrease in overall total energy expenditure, but their physical activity energy expenditure is still higher here at week 30 than it is at baseline. So it's not like they fell off the bandwagon and they're like, we're not exercising anymore. And then when we come back to the reunion, we weren't exercising from being home and away from the ranch. Actually, they were exercising quite a bit still. Not the same amount as in week 6, but still more than at baseline. But the biggest contributor to this decrease in total energy expenditure is your resting metabolic rate, approaching 800 calories per day decrease in resting metabolic rate in these individuals. So what's most of interest here is, yes, this is an alarming number, a decrease in 800 calories per day of energy expenditure, but we also want to know, is this greater than the amount or the decrease in resting metabolic rate that you would expect to see for that change in body composition? Because keep in mind, these individuals lost a large amount of weight. And so this graph shows that relationship perfectly. And so I gave you numbers here to be able to visualize it a little more. But the decrease in measured resting metabolic rate, so this was measured with indirect calorimeter in the lab or at the testing space, was 356 calories per day. What they were predicted to see a decrease in resting metabolic rate according to changes in body composition is 112 calories per day, meaning that your metabolic adaptation here is about 244 calories per day. So that's the greater than expected decrease in resting metabolic rate. And then it continues to increase with this larger amount of weight loss that occurs between week 6 and week 30. So here, seeing a difference in 504 calories per day in our resting metabolic rate, or the greater than predicted decrease in metabolism that occurred in these individuals. So now I want to show you some results from a study in which I was involved in during my PhD. So my PhD supervisor was a co-principal investigator on this weight loss trial called the Montreal-Ottawa New Emerging Team, or McNeil, weight loss trial. And so my interest in looking at data from this trial was to look at this degree of metabolic adaptation that would occur following a 6-month intervention. So there was 2 types of interventions: a combined diet and resistance training intervention, and then a diet alone, which acted as a control condition. And this weight loss intervention was conducted in postmenopausal women living with obesity. And so to give you more details on the intervention, the diet-only group saw a decrease in about 33% of their total energy intake, which was matched to the caloric intake and resistance training group. But then this group received an additional resistance training component, of course. And so you have the addition of 3 supervised exercise training sessions per week. And so the goal here was to see whether the addition of this resistance training can mitigate or reduce some of this metabolic adaptation that we have seen that tends to occur in weight loss interventions. So our measurements include all the same measurements that were done in the Biggest Loser trial. So moving on to our results. So a bit anticlimactic, but of course our weight loss was not as dramatic as what they reported for the Biggest Loser study, but very respectable still for this population in a 6-month intervention. And so on average, the decrease in fat mass was 4 kilograms, in the diet-only group comparatively to 6 kilograms in the combined diet and resistance training group. With a very little change in fat-free mass. So although these were not significantly different, it did show a greater decrease in fat mass in our combined group. When looking at components of the energy expenditure, we saw a decrease in about 50 to 70 calories per day in resting energy expenditure, which is to be expected for this amount of weight loss, and then decreases in total energy expenditure, the majority of it coming from resting metabolic rate, and then slight decreases in physical activity energy expenditure in both groups. But none of these were different between the groups. But what interests us the most here was to look at whether there were differences between measured and predicted resting metabolic rate. So whether there was actually the occurrence of metabolic adaptation, even though there was only small amounts of weight loss that occurred in these women. And so what we noted was actually a significant difference in post-intervention values between those that were measured with indirect calorimeter in the lab comparatively to what was predicted to occur according to changes in body weight. Differences here being approximately, I think that's 22 calories in a day. So again, not a large amount, nowhere near the 800 calories that you saw in the Biggest Loser trial, but still it does occur with smaller amounts of weight reduction. And I have to thank my PhD supervisor for putting this slide together and sending it to me a little while ago, where he actually took this graph from the Biggest Loser study and drew the same graph with our data, and we showed the same relationship as they showed, where we plotted the degree of energy imbalance. And so the greater the degree of energy balance, the more likely you are to lose weight, or the greater the amount of weight loss with metabolic adaptation. So this association shows that those individuals that were in the greatest degree of energy imbalance or lost the greatest amount of body weight had the greatest degree of metabolic adaptation. So simply put, those that were super adherent, that lost a lot of weight and did really well, were those that were more predisposed to potential weight regain with time, or a greater degree of metabolic adaptation reduction in their resting metabolic rate. And we showed the exact same association here in the McNeil study. So to give you a few take-home messages, so to put also a little bit more of a positive spin on this talk, because sometimes when I give this talk, I feel like, oh, it's a bit of a bummer talk. There's really no great news when it comes to resting metabolic rate and weight loss. But even though the concept of energy balance is very simple, okay, energy in, energy out, and you're predisposed to gain weight if your intake is greater than your expenditure, for instance, weight loss is not as simple as eat less and move more. Okay, and so even though we can only behaviorally impact body weight through diet or physical activity, some individuals may experience weight regain after weight loss. They may have difficulty losing weight, even though they're very adherent, even though they follow their diet and their physical activity regimen to a T. And so there could be contributions of that resting energy expenditure to some of these lack of changes in body weight or predispositions to weight gain. So we have to take this into account, but I think it's also very important here not to play a blame game, right? And telling someone, okay, you're regaining weight, or you're not losing weight because you're not doing the diet or physical activity properly, or you're not doing enough dieting and enough physical activity, right? So it could be completely out of their control, and taking that into account in actually measuring energy balance and body weight changes. My second point, and kind of following up on this first point, is that it's important also to promote improvements in physical and mental health factors beyond weight loss. So trials have been conducted where they give them a physical activity prescription, for instance, without any weight loss. So they purposely give them a prescription not to induce weight loss, and they've shown improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness, quality of life, as well as reducing the risk of developing and even treating cardiometabolic conditions. And I find overall that physical activity has a bad reputation in the world of weight loss. Where, like I said at the beginning of my talk, it's not the best route to take. If you want to induce weight loss, you should use diet. But there could be many benefits beyond weight loss, as I mentioned, via physical activity. And finally, like any chronic disease, prevention is much easier than treatment. And so promoting weight maintenance or even reducing the risk of weight gain should be set as health promotion. More so than weight loss, knowing that some of the biological consequences that can occur with weight loss. And that's my talk for today.
So any questions for Jessica?
So when I was thinking about that, do people, with the metabolic adaptation, do people who have more adipose tissue to begin with, is their metabolic rate higher?
So yes, so their absolute resting metabolic rate is higher. But in terms of the decrease in resting metabolic rate relative to the amount of body weight loss, it's not necessarily different. So it's directly tied into the amount of weight you lose. So the greater your weight loss, the greater the degree of metabolic adaptation. And the longer you sustain that weight loss, it seems, too, with the follow-up studies. So they did a follow-up with The Biggest Loser where they measured all the same outcomes again 6 years later. And a lot of these individuals regained their weight, or at least some of the weight. And they've shown that those individuals actually that were able to maintain the weight loss or maintain the greatest amount of weight loss still had the greatest degree of metabolic adaptation. So they had this biological kind of slingshot pulling on them, right?
So it wouldn't be related to, as a person reduce their fat mass, they come down to where the metabolic rate of where a person who never had that mass, when their weights cross, they're still going to be. Yeah,
so it seems to be, so we're not too sure too, with there's theories out there suggesting that we have a set point, and that set point of weight is based on the largest weight you've attained at some point in time. Now, again, this is a theory hypothesis. There's no proof to it. And so simply because of adaptations over time. So you want to maintain that excess weight because it was protective over time. And there's no evidence to show with evolution that, individuals living with obesity have more complications than healthy individuals. Now, with chronic disease, it's different. But so, I mean, at that point, you try to rebound to that initial level, but whether it's, genetically determined at birth, or whether you develop it over time, or whether after you maintain a certain amount of weight loss, let's say for 10 years, does it reset to that new level that you were able to maintain at? We really don't know. Yeah.
But it's not over 5 years, right?
I really don't know.
Biggest
Yeah.
intersection.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mentioned a lot about predicted versus
Yep.
quantified differences.
Yeah.
What is the contributing factors? What do you feel are the contributing factors?
Yeah, of course. So again, it's still unsure exactly what's contributed to it, because in the literature, if you look at all weight loss studies, it's pretty consistent. There's metabolic adaptation, right, with different interventions. What's a little inconsistent is what's causing it. So with this, the study that I conducted with McNeil, or that paper I wrote, we actually looked at the association between leptin and peptide YY with that degree of metabolic adaptation, because we thought that those individuals that had higher levels of leptin and peptide YY, so leptin being independently of the fat mass changes, because it does change with fat mass, would be associated with this metabolic adaptation. We saw no associations. So we saw no associations between the two, but other studies have found associations. Another hypothesis out there is that it could be organ tissue mass and activity that's contributing to that metabolic adaptation. So some individuals may have, from the start, less of a contribution of the organ tissues to resting metabolic rate, or smaller tissue mass. And so if you reduce that, that could be a contributing factor to that difference, because they're less, less heart rate, less activity, less metabolism of food, or digestion of food that occurs. So that's one hypothesis, but again, it's only really been shown in small studies, and it's very difficult to reproduce that. So it could be anywhere from, I would say, organ mass tissue all the way to hormonal variation. So we're kind of still trying to pinpoint exactly what it might be.
So you said in your study that there was no decrease in fat mass levels.
No, so we did see changes in peptide YY and leptin, but it was not associated to this degree of metabolic adaptation. So it decreased with weight loss, like leptin decreased with weight loss, but it wasn't associated with this difference between the two, because we were trying to explain that difference, right, with these hormones.
If you measured, like, I don't know, but receptor levels as well, not just the hormone being produced, but the ability to actually utilize that hormone, because leptin is really strongly linked to energy expenditure.
Yep.
As well, so.
Yeah, so that's why we were looking at specifically both these hormones. No, that's a really good point. I mean, we didn't do that in this study. We just did blood draws. We didn't look at it at the cellular level, unfortunately. But that's a very good point, especially when you talk about any individuals that have maybe potentially leptin resistance as a metabolic condition, then maybe it dissipated, right? So maybe those individuals would have a better outcome. So I think moving forward too in this literature is actually trying to identify those individuals that are able to lose weight and maintain it, and compare it to those individuals that are more predisposed to weight gain, and looking biologically how they are different. Yeah.
In relation to like maintaining weight loss like that, like it seems like you can always get people to lose weight oftentimes, so the maintenance is a huge factor with it.
Yeah.
With like adipose tissue, like you have a 10-year lifespan, they turn over like 10% per year.
Yeah.
Like or whatever. How like, and then you have the set point theory that says that you try and maintain it.
Yeah.
Like what is realistic for someone to actually take? Like you can't have just a huge drastic weight loss and then expect someone to maintain that, because the fact that your body's fighting against that.
Yeah.
Theoretically.
Yeah.
So how do you get people to understand that?
So that's a tough one, right? Yeah, that's a really tough one. And I think it's just kind of goes back to like the messaging that we use, right? Like preventing weight gain over time, and seeing other changes, beneficial changes beyond weight loss. And I know weight loss is easy because it's physical and it's at the forefront, and oftentimes that's someone's goal, right? I want to lose weight. Cardiorespiratory fitness, I don't see it on myself unless I'm running at a high intensity, right? Like I don't see the impact. And so I think it's trying to put at the forefront some of these more physical and mental markers that are just as important. And I mean, you look at something like, quality of life or mental health. And I was talking to a participant in one of my studies this morning, and she was saying that, and she's struggled with weight since her treatment. And she's explained to me that, well, when I exercise, when I go biking, that's when I'm happy, and I do it because it makes me happy, right? And so I explained to her, well, maybe even if you try it, even if you put all this effort into weight loss, you may not be happier, right? Maybe being happy is just getting out and biking again, right? And doing what you like. So I think it's just changing that messaging, right? And I think that's the point here with some of these studies, and too with the Biggest Loser study, right? They were trying to make a big impression. So that's why they went after, a popular TV show and kind of said, this is what really happens. And, but that way too, like even the way they write the paper, it's like, okay, a bit of a downer story, but in the end, it's like, look, they were still successful in losing quite a bit of weight. And, those that regained the amount of weight or that put the pressure on themselves and said, I'm failing because I regained all this weight, were actually those that had bigger mental issues and quality of life issues, right? So I think it's also, putting that, like I said, messaging into perspective. Does that make sense?
I had a question about the increase in physical activity we were talking about in the Biggest Loser study. So you showed this graph where you said week 6 to 30 compared to baseline, they had more physical activity.
Yes. So I can go back to that one. This one?
Yes.
Yeah.
So how do you know that that's not just an effect of a decrease in body weight, because you normalize it to body weight? And
Yeah.
they lost weight in week 6 and 30.
Yeah. So this is normalized calories per kilogram per day.
Yeah. So they obviously lose or lost weight in
Yeah.
week 6 and 30. So how
Yeah.
do you know that that's
Because this is calories, it's per kilogram of body weight. So this is their energy expenditure, increase in physical activity from baseline in calories per kilogram. So if you're smaller, it doesn't matter where you're smaller or bigger, it's calories per kilogram. Does that make sense? It's not absolute values, it's relative.
Well, I think that's what complicates the comparison, right?
Yeah, because if you lose weight, but you still do the same amount of physical activity,
Yeah.
does that give you a higher score on that one?
If you lose weight and you do more physical activity,
You do the same amount of
yes,
physical
yes,
activity.
yes, yes.
So how do you know that what you see here is not an effect of just losing weight, but actually an increase in physical activity? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think,
Yeah.
because I mean, this is, okay, so they put this relative terms, but you look at it in absolute terms here too, right? So here's your total energy expenditure in calories per day. So you're at about 4,000 here, increases to, 4,500 maybe, 4,600, and then decreases here to below 4,000. But that's total. So that includes that weight loss.
Are inconsistent, right? Because between baseline or between week 6 and week 30, they lose weight.
Yep.
And they
Yes, so they lose weight, but the idea here is that they lose weight, and it could be a contribution to that physical activity, but the majority of this decrease is related to your resting metabolic rate, which is related to that weight loss. I'm not trying to say that it's not related to the weight loss, and it's in the next graph that you see that there's a difference between the amount that you predict for that weight loss and what actually occurred. So there 100% will be decreases related to weight loss. And the next graph, like I said, is what distinguishes the two. So looking at it this way. So this distinguishes it between the two. So this is adjusted for the amount of body weight in calories per day. And you see the difference here. And your white points showing your measured, and then black points showing your predicted values.
So, do you think we need to lose weight to be metabolic health, or if we just do exercise and maybe change the diet but don't lose any weight at all, we can still improve metabolically speaking? So,
Yeah.
improve of insulin, glucose, triglycerides, and cholesterol. And if that is the case, why are we trying to make people to lose weight
Yeah.
was good for us. So
Yeah.
why now are we trying to fight something that might be good for us?
That's a good question. That's an excellent question. I don't know why we're trying to fight it. I don't know. And it's funny, I was having a conversation a couple weeks ago at a conference with a researcher who does this kind of work as well. And they were saying that with her student, they were actually trying to compare not the quality of, I don't want to say quality of obesity or overweight today, whereas it was 100 or so years ago or in our ancestors. But they're finding that metabolically, we're actually healthier today, even though overall we have greater rates of obesity than 100 years ago, for instance, or in our ancestors, where rates of obesity were actually lower, but there were rates of obesity were more so related to being metabolically unhealthy. Now, how are they determining that? They're looking at kind of the link between metabolic conditions or chronic diseases kind of plateauing, even though rates of obesity are increasing. So it's not necessarily that, obesity is leading to, it is a risk factor for many chronic diseases. I don't want to undermine that. But it's also, you can be living with obesity and be metabolic healthy, like you could be lean or normal weight and have metabolic conditions, right, or predisposed. So.
So let's say that you have two obese people, two people with obesity,
Yeah.
and one person is having a health diet, but it's obese,
Mm-hmm.
and the other person is eating really crap diet with lots of sugar and
Sure.
all kinds of fat. Metabolically speaking, do you think that one person can be healthy and the other one not? So maybe now what we see with obesity is because it's the diet that we have that is not as
Potentially, yeah.
good as it was
Yeah.
before.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah.
Should we look for that when we do these clinical trials? Because usually we just have the BMI and we say this is a obese person and let's have the same treatment for this person. Doesn't matter if we
Yeah.
have metabolic syndrome behind that or not. So what should be the next step we should accomplish?
So I think, the next step, and I think you've hit the nail on the head with both of your comments and questions. I think it's, changing that perception and that being metabolically healthy can be separate of body weight. Now, body weight is a predictor for chronic conditions or diseases, but if someone is weight stable, even though they're living with obesity and they're very metabolically healthy and they're able to maintain this body weight, why change that? Right? So, especially if that inducing weight loss could lead to risk of weight regain, and then if they regain that weight, it could impact their quality of life. But if they're happy at the beginning, why try to disrupt that? Right? And if they're metabolically healthy, if their cholesterol levels and everything checks in and they're metabolically healthy, why change that? So I think, no, you hit the nail on the head. I fully agree with your statements.
Another quick question.
Yeah.
I like the breakdown of the different contributions, say, organ,
Yeah.
skeletal mass, etc. Do you know of any evidence of how much you can change caloric consumption from just brain activity, someone who's like almost a vegetative state versus studying at your desk basically all day? So is there any evidence of being able to modify that much, and if so, how much?
Yeah, good question. I don't know.
Yeah.
I would have to look into it. Yeah, I don't know. Some of this evidence, that was presented in a textbook.
Okay.
And I think these are hard to get to evidence because you almost need cadavers or biopsies or, you know what I mean? To actually look at the relative contribution of it. No, that's an interesting question. I don't know.
Yeah, I know my supervisor in my PhD would always argue that this has had a huge consumption based on how much he thought, but
Yeah, mental activity. Yeah. It's funny, there's this one small study that was done out of Laval University where they actually compared the impact of mental work on energy intake. So what they did is they had these participants in a randomized crossover design. So the same participant did both conditions. So the control was that they sat, lying, basically reclined in this chair, right, for an hour. And then the other mental work condition, they were given, I think, a magazine article to read and then summarize in 300 words or something like that in that same hour, right? So just depicting typical mental work that you could see at your desk. And they measured their energy expenditure during both sessions. So while they were reclining, relaxing, and while they were doing this mental work. And then they gave them ad lib access to a lunch afterwards. So free access to food. You know, here's a buffet lunch, eat what you want. And we measure it pre-post intake. And what they found was that the difference in energy expenditure between conditions was only about 12 calories, but the difference in intake was 300. So people ate more when they did the mental work comparatively to the control condition, even though their expenditure was very minimal. So probably not a lot in the grand scheme of things. I don't know if it's directly related to brain activity, but yeah. So it just goes to show these small studies can have, yeah, cool findings. Yeah.
Any other questions for Jeff? Oh, John.
Yeah, when people, let's say they recover their weight after the weight loss session, do they maintain the metabolic adaptation at their?
They tend to keep it all. So
when they pop back
yeah,
to their high weight?
yeah. So the first study that comes to mind is the original Minnesota Semistarvation Study.
Yeah.
So that was done in the mid-40s, and it was in lean men. And what they found was that at the end of the refeeding period, their weight was 180% of what it was at baseline, so they regained more weight than what they did at baseline after this weight loss. And the resting metabolic rate was 90% of baseline levels. So there's a huge discrepancy between the two. Yeah, and like I said, these were in that original study, so it's a hard field. It's a hard field. Like I remember like reading about this and being like, this is such a bummer story. Yeah, so. Yeah.
Any final questions for Jeff? All right, let's thank her one more time for her talk. All right, next week we'll have Dr. Ryan Peters present on the topic of a signal from noise, stochastic somatosensory stimulation for probing human motor control. See you next week and help yourself to coffee and cookies. Maybe not. On the way out.